Hello, and welcome to the Race, Wealth, and Health Podcast, a podcast that serves to educate and empower while we explore the intersections of social justice, economic empowerment, and holistic well-being within communities of color. I am your host, Dr. Joycelyn Morris, and I invite you to join me as we dive deep into the crucial topics that shape our lives, challenge the status quo, and strive for a more equitable future for all. This week, we're back for part 2 of our conversation with Lance Bennett as we delve into unpacking and understanding privilege.
Yeah. And so, again, as you're doing these training, I'm imagining, but correct me if I'm wrong, you're in rooms that don't just reflect particular identities that you and I both share. And so what is that experience like in terms of being there, facilitating, and having to get different people of different identities, right? Because I'm assuming there's privilege across even some of the identities that you said you struggled with identifying with, that there's still privilege of some of those underrepresented identities based on other classes and based on other part of an individual identities. And so what is that experience like for you, right? To be who you are in the room in a country where, like you said, you can't not experience being Black in America. And so what is that like to be in front of, a diverse crowd and sort of having people question or think about the way that they see different groups and identities?
Yeah. I would say it's challenging, but it's also like exhilarating to know, because 90%, probably 95% of the audience that I'm speaking with are not Black people. Because I do a lot of my workshops and trainings at business schools, corporations. I led a training, a military battalion, nonprofit, but most of them are not Black people, and many are not people of color, as a matter of fact. And so what makes it challenging and exhilarating at the same time is I have an audience that I get an opportunity to share my journey, and I hope that they sort of adopt what I'm saying and use that as the mirror. I actually had a participant tell me that one time. They said, what I loved about how you led this workshop was you didn't tell us what to do, but you put a mirror he told me that he said, you put a mirror in my face and you had me take a look at myself. And then you basically said, do what you like with what you see. Right. He said, you didn't try to mandate it. You didn't try to say you all are wrong. You got to change. You just put a mirror up, and that mirror, what I see in that mirror, I don't like. And there are some changes that need to be made. So thank you for putting the mirror in front of me. So that's my goal. That's what I'm trying to do is create, again, a psychologically safe space and challenge those who are in the room to think about who they are and how they show up. That's the work. That's why the work, that's how it worked for me, because literally I thought those facilitators over those 3.5 days put a mirror up in front of me and said, do you do these things? Do you think this way? And if you do, are you comfortable with that? And if you are, great, go on about your business. But if you're not, let me tell you things that you may be able to do that can help you change some of those things. Let me give you some ways to think about kind of who you are and how you show up and how you might show up differently. And so that's what I try to do. So it's actually fun. I love it. I just like, it takes a lot of energy and emotional energy, because sometimes some of the comments that come from participants can be triggering, right? And so triggering to me personally, and I have to manage myself and at the same time manage the others in the room where it might be triggering to others. So acknowledge it, talk about it, but do it in a way that doesn't, judge or just, throw the person away for saying it. And at the same time, be able to acknowledge that those who may have heard this, you may be feeling a particular way. And if you do, let's talk about that. And then let's continue to move on. So it's great work. It's great work.
Yeah, yeah. And like in those situations when you just think of like, how do you manage those triggers? How have you learned to manage that? Because it sounds like this is the type of work that we all have to do. I think if we think about it from the position of the idea that we all have privilege in some
Mm,
way, shape, or form, and it eliminates the idea of saying, hey, group, you are the bad group, right? Like you're the
mhm.
villain, you're the oppressor in the story to where but
Yeah.
from the perspective when we think about all of our privileges and we have that conversation and we're able to say these are the ways that each and every one of us has some sort of privilege, but we have to be willing to recognize that privilege is. Do you think that that kind of a key to doing the work of bridging some of these, I wouldn't say gaps, but sort of bridging the space between our groups as we think about the histories of collectively two groups?
Yeah. I think the group that, when you mentioned not necessarily being able to see these things, I think the group that is the most challenging and the ones that I think come in with the most skepticism are heterosexual white men. I mean,
Mm,
because they are not part of what you would consider a major oppressed group unless they are living with a disability or something like that.
fair.
But if not, like a lot of times it is hard for them to relate to feeling oppressed at any particular time. So if you don't know what it feels like, it is hard to relate to someone who does, compared to if I'm talking to, a white woman, she can at least tap into things that she may have experienced as a woman and then be
Mhm.
able to translate that to her whiteness and go, oh, yeah, if I felt that as a woman, I might be projecting that same thing as being a white person on someone as a person of color. The
Right.
heterosexual white man is the one that makes that's the where it's more difficult. So you asked kind of earlier, a little bit earlier, you know, what are some ways and how do you manage that? Some of it is me, right? Some of it is, I might acknowledge what I hear, share some experience that I've had, but then there are other times I leverage the group to do the work. So
Mhm.
someone may say something, let's just say they say something that is, like could be looked upon disparaging the women. And I might say something like, hmm, that's an interesting comment. I'd love to hear, does anyone in the room want to reply to that? And so then I'm basically giving the space for a woman to say, well, as a woman, I didn't really appreciate that particular comment. I'll give you a quick example. I give this example about, a
Mhm.
woman being afraid of me at one point because of a compromising space that we were in. And I ask them, the participants, do you think this would be more around race or around gender? And some other options I give them, but we'll just kind of stick to race and gender now. And I remember there was a man that said, well, I think it was, around race and race only, because if I were in the elevator and, I show up as in a suit, I don't think she would have been frightened. And so I've heard from enough women now to know that it does not matter what the race of the person is. If you're in a compromising position as a man, we pose a threat, right? And so I said, okay, that's an interesting perspective. Anyone want to, like answer that or challenge that? And I mean, like 3 or 4 women's hand like quickly raised, and they were like, no, let me tell you, it would not matter who was in this space with me. I would
Mhm.
not feel comfortable because any man, I don't care how they're dressed. And so they were teaching this man something
Mhm.
about his group, and I didn't have to do that.
Mhm. Mhm.
So sometimes you leave the space for the participants to do it, and then
Mhm.
sometimes I may do it, and then I may come back and go, so what she just said is exactly what I've learned over the years as I've had these conversations with multiple women over the years and literally talk about this. so that I know my group. So some of it is you do it, sometimes you allow others. And in the moment, over the years I've been doing this, it sort of just becomes natural. You kind of know when you should and when
Mm-hmm.
you shouldn't and when you need to have others do it. And so, but it takes, like I said, it takes experience. It takes, some time and being in a room. I've led hundreds and hundreds of workshops now over the years. So I'm not saying that I'm great at it, but I'm pretty darn good at being able to create a, like I said, psychologically safe space and manage the room based on the dynamics that are in the room and who's in the room. And I look at all that, prior to even going into the space. And so yeah, and that's where the energy comes from. Cause you're literally in the moment, you're making decisions like left
Yeah.
and right. Like, do I answer it? Do I use this example now? Because this might be too much for this group. Do I use a lighter example for this group? Oh no, we
Mhm.
can go heavy with this group, and like literally I'm kind of doing it in the moment because I have so many personal experiences and experience that I've learned from others over the years that I can
Mhm.
pull out, examples and at any time, and trying to find the right one that's going to resonate with that group, is that's the beauty of the work and the fun part of the work really for me. So, and
Yeah.
you've seen me present before, by the way, too.
Absolutely. I was
So
gonna say I think you do a great job. You're like, good. I was like, no, you do a great job. Absolutely. Which is why I want to have you on the podcast. But yeah, I feel like you touched on a few of the point. Obviously, this is the Race, Wealth, and Health podcast, right? Like,
mm,
how do you see any, some, or all of those tenets intersecting with the work that you do?
yeah, they all intersect. The it's equity and inclusion, but also providing access is also really important in this
Mhm.
work. So when I think about, the race one is easy, as a Black person in this work and trying to, I'm certainly trying to advance racial equity in my full-time work at MLT, but, also in these spaces where I'm facilitating workshops, I'm trying to create a space where people are acknowledging people of color and giving opportunities. The health and wealth, one of the ways that they intersect is COVID, as terrible and as horrible as COVID was,
Mhm.
and, actually still is, but leveraging what we saw come out of COVID,
Mhm.
especially from the gaps, the health gaps and the wealth gaps and the education gaps, we
Mhm.
can reference those things to be able to have, more concrete conversations and go, we saw this happening. We saw
Yeah.
the number of people of color, the indigenous community, my God. I mean, like
Yeah.
they were the hardest hit out of the people of
Mhm.
color, right? So
Mhm.
so those are numbers that you can easily just show and go like, why is it that this group of people suffered more,
Mhm.
and it's the same disease. And so you start understanding things like access to healthcare and all those other things. So, and where you are from a resource wise, wealth made a difference as well. I mean, I had COVID really early and I also had really good healthcare. So I was able to be seen quickly. I mean, I was
Mhm.
living in Chicago at the time, and where they were saying it's going to take, sometimes it's taking 3, 4, 5 weeks for people to get test results back. Cause I had it really early, like March of 2020.
Wow.
And
Okay.
yeah, like I'm usually patient zero for almost everybody that I know. They're like, you're the first person that told me that they had COVID. And I go to get tested and I get my test results the next day. But
Mhm.
part of that is I work at a university at Northwestern where we had great healthcare. Or I had great healthcare. And so I could go to a place, I could get in the same day and I could get my results the next day. And then I'm watching the news and there are people who are saying it's weeks before they can even find out what their result is. And at this point, some people are already dead, unfortunately, right?
Yeah.
So it's things like that where you start understanding how health and wealth and race can all sort of intersect. I'm also going to talk about health from a different perspective. The work that I do, it's really important for me to try to help others. I mean, that's sort of my thing, right? It's been the work that I told you even back when I wanted to be a manager, is because I wanted to help others have a good work environment. You know, working at Wake Forest, working in admissions, Kellogg, helping people get into the business school that I work for. Now helping people get into business school, and now helping others understand who they are and how they show up to try to promote, equity and inclusion, right? So that sort of been the person that I have been my whole life. And so last year, from a health perspective, I was not taking care of myself very well from a health perspective. And so I've suffered from high blood pressure, like from my 20s, when I was in good shape and playing basketball and tennis all the time, and was, hereditary, right? So I had that. But then, over the years, as I gained weight, then all of a sudden, I take cholesterol medicine. And then last year in July, I go to my doctor for my, normal yearly checkup, which again, privilege, right? And, I'm pre-diabetic, and I have an African-American doctor, a woman, and she's fantastic. And we had a heart to heart. And I also realized that I can't really help others if I'm not taking care of myself, physically. So yeah, emotionally, and, I can facilitate, but if I am not well physically, I can't really help take care of others, not only just in my work, but obviously, family and all the other stuff. So I kind of went on a journey to try to get healthier since July of last year, and have been able to do that. And I'm not pre-diabetic anymore and all that. But I mention that because talk about health and wealth. I'm not wealthy by any stretch of the imagination, but I do have the means to buy healthier food. I have the means to determine kind of from a flexibility standpoint, build my calendar and determine like when is the best time for me to start my day and end my day. And so I could do that and really kind of take control of my own health journey, where there are many people who don't have that same level of access and resources to be able to do that. So I look at privilege in lots of different ways. And that's just another one of those spaces that I have privilege in, is being able to do that. And I literally just kind of push my day back. And in the morning is when, I work out almost every day, and, and eat differently and all that kind of stuff. But I can make different choices at restaurants, and, where other people may not be able to afford some of the things, because it is much more expensive to eat healthier than not,
That's the whole
so
thing, right? And why should
it's
it be? But that's neither here nor there,
right,
right?
right,
But yeah,
right.
no, absolutely. No, that
So
makes a
yeah,
lot
so
of
they all intersect for me in lots of different ways, personally, as well as, the work that I'm doing. And most of the people who are in my workshops, I'm talking C-suite people to, those who are going to MBAs. And so they are already at a particular place in their career, and they are going to move up in their career. So they are going to have the opportunity to make decisions that impact people. So it certainly intersects in my work that way, because I want them, hopefully when they leave my workshop, to think a little bit differently, so that when they're making decisions, they're thinking about people who are not part of their privileged identities as well.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I love that. And so, what do you think that we, as individuals or collective communities, should be thinking about, and maybe even what's top of mind for you as you think about the future of DEI, right? Especially with everything that's sort of happening politically, right? The Supreme Court pullback, and then and all the lawsuits that have since come that are challenging affirmative action, which is where a lot of the DEI work and initiatives basically were, founded from. How are you viewing that, and what do you think we should be thinking about as we think about the future of DEI work?
Yeah, that's probably the hardest question that you've asked me. Well, one thing obviously is we all personally have an opportunity to make decisions, personal decisions that can have an impact on others. So, for example, voting, and I know this is not a podcast that is, politically motivated, but I can tell you that I will always vote in a way that I think that a party is going to try to take care of people who are not as privileged as others. Right. So for me, look, I'm a Democrat and, I don't mind sharing that. But even if I thought that a tax cut might benefit me personally, or a policy might benefit me personally, especially in my finances, I also have people in my own family who need those who are thinking about those who are less fortunate. And so I'm always going to prioritize voting in a way that is going to benefit those who are more marginalized in our community. So that's one thing. We kind of talked a little bit about that. And this is I don't have to mention it probably to whoever is viewing this, but this is a big one coming up here in November. And so we all have an opportunity to, have our voice heard from that perspective.
Mm.
I think there are a few things that I talk about this. I have a model that I built called Brave Privilege. And brave privilege is really around what are things that we can do as individuals to leverage our privileged identities to promote inclusion. And there are a couple of things. One is first of all, we have to acknowledge our privilege.
Yeah.
Right. And we also have to spend some time with it, like look for examples. All you have to do is really just start looking over your life, and you can start seeing examples of how being part of a privileged identity has helped you and assisted you. And I gave some examples of me earlier. The next is sort of engage in communities that you don't typically engage with, especially those communities that are, oppressed or marginalized. Spending some time in those communities, engaging uncomfortably is what I call it. Right.
Mhm.
So if the only time that we talk to someone who is different from us, or someone from an oppressed group, is at work, in a meeting, on Zoom, right?
Mhm.
Or, maybe at a holiday party or something, if that's the only time we engage, I would not call that uncomfortable. So really being able to spend some time in the community, like talking to people, and engaging doesn't mean you have to go to something. It could mean just having conversations about the difference and about the experience of those who are different from us.
Mhm.
Educating ourselves to understand the experience of others is really important. There's a lot of information out there.
Mm.
We have a full-time job to take care of ourselves.
Yep.
We've got lots of things going on in our own lives, our health and our income and our work and, our families and relationships and all these things that we have to think about. So oftentimes it's not because we're bad people. We just don't think about the experience of others because we got all these other things on our mind.
Yeah.
But if we're really going to have an inclusive space, and we're going to create inclusive spaces, we have to build the capacity to think about others. And so one of the ways to do that is to educate yourself on that. If you have not spent a lot of time or don't know a lot about a particular group, the internet is full of information, and some of it is really good. Right. So that
Not all of it,
we
though.
can,
That's the
not
thing.
all of it, but
Yeah.
a lot of it is really good. Right.
Mhm.
So, and then, being able to take some of what we learn, and then we can start promoting language and using language that is more inclusive, doing some things that is more inclusive. I often introduce myself with my pronouns. I have pronouns in my email address, in my email signature, just things that sort of normalize things for others. I don't ever have to worry about someone misgendering me and thinking that I'm not a
Right.
man, right?
Yeah.
I never have to worry about that. Because I present that way, and that's how I self-identify, but that's not the experience of everyone else. So
Absolutely.
sometimes it's important to do that. And then
Mhm.
finally, we all have an opportunity, as we start learning and engaging with differences, to educate our own group on what we learn. So nothing's more important to me than talking to other heterosexuals about my experience in the LGBTQ plus community, and sort of taking what we typically say about this community and be able to say that hasn't been my experience.
Yeah.
Let me tell you what my experience is.
Mhm.
Educating men on the things that I've learned about gender inequality, right?
Yeah.
Nothing's more important than me doing that. And so the more I do that, because I don't have an agenda when I am telling another heterosexual about my experience in the LGBTQ community. If it's
Mhm.
somebody from the LGBTQ community that's doing it, they have an agenda. So they may not be heard nearly as strongly or powerfully as my voice might be. So I try to use my voice with my own privileged groups and educating
Mm.
them on what I've
Mhm.
learned. And, I'm overly optimistic person. And
Yeah.
so I believe if you know, then you're going to do differently. But if you don't know, then, because it's really easy to be ignorant of the experience of other people. And if you're ignorant, that's a great place to be because then you don't have to do anything.
Yeah.
Right.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah. But when you know,
Yeah.
and then you choose not to do anything, that's when, judgment can come in. So I
Mhm.
try to educate so that, especially my own groups, my own privileged identities, so that it might challenge you to think differently and maybe do something a little differently. So I think all of us can do that, Joycelyn, without having to go and, oh, I got to go march in a rally and I got to go and do all these
Yeah.
things. No, we can all do things personally to promote and build inclusivity in those spaces that we occupy.
Absolutely. And as we kind of wrap, like, what's one quote or book or a resource that you want to give to listeners? Whereas the quote you live by that you want to kind of give to listeners, and any other resource
Yeah,
that are helpful?
I'm glad you asked because, and I knew you were going to ask me this. So I had to really think about it and I wanted to make sure that I would say it right. And there's so many, but there are two
Yeah.
quotes. So I'm not going to give you one. There's two. So one is by Dr. King and it is darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that.
Mhm.
Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. My work is inspired by heart. I always tell people like, there are DEI facilitators who are going to do a lot more research and have a lot more numbers. I have those, but I do heart work because I believe in love. It's part of how I was raised. My mother was love people way almost to a fault. And so I have a lot of that in me. And then of course my faith, mandates me to love. So that's one quote that I try to live by. And then the
Mhm.
other is let your smile change the world, but don't let the world change your smile.
Mm,
And
I like that.
and that one is important to me because it reminds me that there is a way I want to show up every day.
Mhm.
And I am going to try my best not to allow others to change how I want to show up.
Mhm.
Right. So, yes, you can trigger me. Yes, you can make me upset, but that doesn't have to change how I show up to
Yeah.
others. It doesn't have to
Mhm.
change the way I feel about you. Maybe we can have a conversation about it. So those two, they sort of stand out for me.
I love that. I love that. And I think you gave a listener some actual steps already. But again, as we close out, what are some ways if folks want to continue to follow you or your work or learn a little bit more, website, social links, anything that that you can provide for them to stay in touch and stay connected?
Yeah, thanks. So my website is lebpartners.net. My email address, I would love to hear from someone if they have questions. Obviously, if you're looking for someone to do some facilitation, I'd be more than happy to have that conversation as well. But it is L Bennett, so like Lance, L Bennett at lebpartners.net. That's my email address. And no, this was so enjoyable to talk to you, of course, my friend. I realized I didn't address one question that you asked me, and you asked me about sort of the future of DEI, and I was like, that's a hard question.
It is, yeah.
Um, and I didn't want to completely avoid it, but what I will tell you for me, I've been spending a lot of time over the last few weeks kind of thinking about how do I position myself and, language labels that I use so that I'm not, my work is not completely shut out just based on a label, right? So, I
Mhm.
typically say I work in equity and inclusion. I don't really use the word diversity as much anymore, only
Mhm.
because I think equity and inclusion is more important than just simply representation.
Yeah.
Um, but how do I even start, you know, adjusting or that language so that someone doesn't easily go, oh, okay, like you can't have a conversation. So I've been thinking about how do we talk about engagement, whether that is employee engagement, whether that is student engagement with each other, like how do we use that language? Because it still is, it boils down to how can I not just treat you, but do I understand a little bit about your experience so that I can treat you in a way and I can do some things that might make that experience different for you compared to I just want to, oh, I can communicate with you and I can talk to you because we're on the same team and we do the same work. So that's what I've been thinking about is how can we sort of change some labels around, not water down the work. That's not what I mean, but
Right.
can we change our labeling and some of our language so that we can continue to do the work and do the work in maybe especially in spaces that don't want us to do the work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for circling back to it. I mean, I felt like you, but I get it. And so, yeah, this is good. Thank you so much, Lance, for this very enriching conversation. Thank you for your authenticity always and sharing, your experiences and how you got into this work. And, it's important for us to keep having these conversations because to your point, working towards equity and inclusion is important for everybody. And so I'm encouraged to continue the work in spite of everything that some of the outside noise that's going on. I think, working towards equity and inclusion is important and it benefits us all. But thank you for coming and talking to us and helping us understand that all of us have some sort of privilege that we're probably and likely overlooking. And I think that's huge. I think let's just take away nothing else. Take away, their ability to look at that and recognize there's at least one privileged class that they're likely a part of.
Yeah. Can I say one other thing before we close is sometimes it is hard to do that. Like I said, when we're part of a group that is being oppressed and we feel
Yeah.
that oppression, sometimes it's also hard to do that. And I'm acknowledging that it is hard to recognize and try to do work from a privileged identity when your oppression is not being addressed. Right.
Absolutely.
And so sometimes, and I'm acknowledging that that is the harder part of this. You can acknowledge it, but do I really, like, you're asking me to think about others and maybe do things that will make life more inclusive for others when I don't believe others are doing that for me
Same for
in
me.
in my oppression. Right. So, it took some time for me to get there. And that's the one thing that I certainly want to leave your listeners with is that I am not saying, oh yeah, everybody should just look into their privilege and you should just do all these things. Yes, I think you should. And I'm acknowledging that our oppression sometimes can be overwhelming. And so we have to find a balance that we feel good about how we do the work. For me, it's important to do it, but everybody is not at that particular place at the moment. So little bit at a time, every little bit helps. Okay. And now I think I'm done for real.
No, this is great. This is great. Thank you so much, Lance. Yes. And so we have all of the resources, the quote, the website. And again, I just thank you for coming and sharing your story with me.
Thank you for creating the space, my friend.
Absolutely. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks. You too.
Well, that's all for today, folks. Enjoyed the show? Be sure to like and rate the podcast. You can find the Race, Wealth, and Health podcast on multiple platforms, including Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe and turn on your notifications so you never miss an episode. I also want to hear from you, so don't forget to connect with me on social media. You can follow the podcast on Instagram and Facebook at Race, Wealth, Health. By joining the online community, you'll stay updated on the latest episodes, behind the scenes insights, and engaging discussions. Share your thoughts, comments, and questions there. I appreciate your support in sharing the podcast with your friends, family, and colleagues who may also find value in these conversations. Thank you again for joining me on this journey. Until next time, take care, stay informed, and keep up the good fight for equality.